Welcome to another edition of Disability and You. I'm Ganesh Singh, and on this edition, I will be discussing blind education and its evolution here in Guyana. Joining me on this edition is Royden Maynard and Julie Lewis. Royden is an educator, and we can say a blind educator, and he's been in the system for decades, working both in the mainstream environment and also with children who are blind and visually impaired. Royden has also been a beneficiary of the blind education system in Guyana. Julie Lewis is no stranger to the program, and she has been in the field of journalism for a number of years, but we're going to focus on her time in the education system as a student who is blind. She has been or was one of the first beneficiary of blind education in Guyana, and she'll share with us her experience, including the challenges and what can be done to improve the system. So without further ado, I'll go straight into my discussion with Roy and Julie. Roy, let's start, well, I'll start with Julie because she is a student and would have been one of the first that would have benefited from blind education here in Guyana. Julie, tell us a bit when it all started and what were some of the measures put in place at that time to accommodate you and others with vision disabilities.
Well, I can't exactly say when it all started. I can say when it started for me. And that was around 1971. When I got there, I was the only girl. I was the only girl for about 2 or 3 years. There was a boy there before me, and some others joined same time as I did, and some subsequent when I joined. I was a child, obviously, very small, just around 7, 8. And so my memory might be that of a child, but what I do recall, I was not totally blind at the time. I had some vision, but I found it very interesting as a child, coming from the regular school system, where I struggled immensely, that there were actually systems in place to accommodate someone like me. In the regular school, as you would know, you have to write everything into an exercise book, and I couldn't see the lines. But when I got to the school, to the David Rose School for Handicapped Children, even if I was writing on paper, the teachers darkened the lines so I could have seen them. The interesting thing, though, was that I started learning Braille. And because I could have seen a little bit, they hid the Braille paper in a box, and I had to familiarize myself with the dots without trying to peer at them. It was interesting learning that way, because it enabled me to read something I loved doing but couldn't do while I was in the
But
regular
when you
school
learned the
system.
Braille, you were able to read.
Oh, definitely. I became as one of the teachers like to say, an avid reader. Anything I read, once it was in Braille,
You read
didn't
it.
matter what it was, I read it.
So they were trained, I assume they were trained personnel at that time to teach you the Braille.
We had a unique system, which I couldn't understand why my brothers and sister were promoted from class to class every year. I wasn't, because we had just one teacher, and that one teacher had to teach every child regardless of your level of what's the word, acuity, or aptitude. So we were all in one class. Fortunately or unfortunately, we were just about 10, and so that teacher taught us everything. She did go for some training. I remember that she was away for a few months at one time in the States, and when she came back, she was all so excited, telling us about all the various ways she was taught or she was exposed on how to teach children who are blind.
So,
So she learned Braille. Well, she had known Braille before, but of course she learned it a little. She was telling us how she used to be blindfolded and had to learn to eat and had to learn to do all these things. So she was able to pass those things on to us, teach us table manners, how to use a knife and fork and so on as a blind person because she was exposed to it.
and this was all in the early 70s.
This was all in the early 70s, yes.
But were you exposed while at the unit for the blind, or at the David Rose School, sorry, in those early years, were you exposed to any mainstream classroom, or it was just strictly in that segregated class?
It was strictly in the segregated class. And in the David Rose School has, even now, many types of disabilities.
Yes.
So we were confined to one class.
And that was a class specifically for children who were blind and visually
Yes.
impaired. All right, Julie, I'll go to Roy. Roy, you would have done research in the evolution of blind education in Guyana, and you would have also at some point in your life been a student in that system. But let's speak about your research. What did you find in the early days as it relates to blind education? What were some of the systems? Julie would have mentioned what she experienced, but based on your research, if you can highlight some of the, the things that really jumped out at you in your research as it relates to blind education in the early days.
Yes, Ganesh, thanks for having me on the program. Yes, what happened, and Julie gave her historical perspective based upon her experience. And in 1968, when the Unit for the Blind was established there in the David Rose compound, because as Julie pointed out, the David Rose School for the Handicapped dealt with all manners, all types of
disability.
Yes, all types of disabilities, but they had a unit for the blind, and it was very much segregated. When we speak about Guyana, though, what we need to bear in mind is that Guyana is part of a regional and international context, and what was happening in the world impacted what happened in Guyana. Julie told you just now about her teacher that went to the US and then brought back her experience to them. And that is the very interesting thing that I found in my research, that while we were experiencing certain developments and evolutions here at the local level, at least at this standpoint of a student, we were not aware that you had actors internationally and forces internationally that were influencing what was happening here. Let me give you an example. So in 1968, the unit was set up, and basically when you look at the education philosophy at the time, we will refer to that as segregation.
Yes.
Now, in the 70s, a movement started to happen, and it started in America. America and England, for decades and decades, they had organizations and NGOs looking out for blind welfare, education being a part of that. And then teachers and professionals who went and interacted with that system brought back their experiences here. Now, in the late 1970s, something started to happen internationally where blind education is concerned. You had a kind of a paradigm shift that took place then, where people were now agitating for integration of blind students into the mainstream system. And that impacted what happened in blind education here in the late 1970s, so much so that in 1980, the unit which was part of the David Rose
yes.
compound was migrated over to St. Rose's. Now, we know St. Rose's is a
mainstream school.
Yes, it's a mainstream school, and you have several schools in that compound. And one of the reasons that they chose St. Rose's is that St. Rose's, in close vicinity and in the same compound to some extent, had all levels. You had nursery there, you had primary
Secondary.
and the secondary there. And so that is why St. Rose's was chosen more
yeah.
as an experiment. And the thing about it is this. What I found is that the Caribbean Council for the Blind actually held up the Guyanese example to the rest of the Caribbean and say, hey, they're doing this in Guyana and it's successful. So let's follow the Guyanese model. And so something similar was done in St. Lucia later on. All right. Now, as I said, all of this had an international context. And also what happened from 1978 onwards is that internationally, educators, thinkers, policymakers started to take the concept of integration very seriously.
And that is having the children who are blind in the mainstream classroom.
Right.
That is what you're speaking of integration.
Right. Work in the mainstream classroom. But what happened is that in Guyana and elsewhere too, it happened subsequently, was that the children would go into the mainstream classroom, do their work, and then they would go back to the unit for the blind. In this case, it was at St. Rose's, and they would provide them with that kind of support to read the textbooks and maybe transcribe the notes and so on.
And teach them the skills that they'll need to know, like.
Right. I was a beneficiary of that system. Now, coming forward to around 1995.
But let's hold on the early 80s, because I want to get Julie to come in here, because she was in the system from 71, she said. And then when they migrated to St. Rose's, what was that transition like for you as a student, Julie?
Exciting, because I had always dreamed of getting an education beyond what the David Rose School provided. I mean, they taught us the basics in terms of English and maths and so on. But I wanted a lot more than that. So this was the perfect opportunity for me to be able to excel, or at least if not excel, at least expand my horizons educational wise. So of course it was interesting, I'm sure, from the point of view of the students that we had to deal with in St. Rose's, but certainly for us, because even though we weren't in boarding school settings and we grew up with our siblings and our parents and we were exposed to them doing homework and so on, it was still quite something else, having to actually sit down in a class with the students. And I remember, I'm not trying to be arrogant or so, but I remember in one of the first English classes that I attended, I remember going back into the unit and saying, "Miss, that work's so easy." You know, it was for the, it was preparing us for the CXC, but it looked so, you know, not so challenging to me, because I guess
because of your love for reading,
and the credit to the teachers too, even though they had to cope with children at various levels, as I said, in their aptitude and so on. They did a very good job in preparing us for the mainstream experience. Yes.
Roy, before in the early segment, you would have ventured into the 1995. Let's elaborate a bit more. What happened in the 90s as it relates to blind education?
Before we go straight there, I would like to stress a little bit on the role of the Caribbean Council for the Blind in the development of blind education in Guyana. Because what happened when the unit was set up at St. Rose's, the ministry took responsibility for that, and of course the staff would have been paid by the ministry, but a lot of the support in terms of equipment and so on came from the Caribbean Council for the Blind. And as I said earlier, what was happening in Guyana reflected the forces and the philosophies that were developing overseas. Now, in 1995, in Jomtien, Thailand, the United Nations issued a declaration. And part of that declaration said that all disabled children children with disabilities have the right to the same education as their able-bodied peers. Now, the Juntian Declaration did not specify that this education has to happen in a mainstream system, because at that time, I guess people thought that, okay, we can give them an education that is on par with what is happening in the mainstream system, but it can be done in a segregated setting. Now, the thing about the philosophy shift is that the interesting semantic space that the policymakers place between two words, integration and inclusion. And what was happening in the 1990s is what we call integration. That is where the blind students were allowed to work in the mainstream system, and they received support from teachers at the unit for the blind, wherever that unit was located. And that is what they call integration. But then coming on later on, again, we had another shift in philosophy where they started to talk about inclusion. Now, the difference between these two is that where integration is concerned, they allow the blind child to be in the classroom, but the responsibility to cope with the work is on that child and on the unit for the blind. Inclusion, on the other hand, places that responsibility squarely in the lap of the mainstream school. So they have the responsibility to provide the service. Now, right now in Guyana, that's just a pipe dream, because we know that practically what happens is integration. We really don't have inclusion as it. As I was reading something a couple of months ago, one educator defined the two terms like this. He said that integration seeks to have the blind child adapt to the mainstream system. Inclusion seeks to have the mainstream system adapt to the needs of the blind students.
And that's how it's supposed to be.
Right, that's how it's supposed to be, and that is when you will really unlock the potential of the blind students. Because let me give you an example.
But just to add there, Roy, and that philosophy is a reflection of the social model of disability, where it's no longer the individual, but it's society that needs to be modified to suit persons with disabilities or to accommodate.
Right.
And that's where the world is going. And Guyana, we really need to get in that direction very fast. And go ahead.
Yes. So I'm going to highlight one particular, maybe two subject areas that can really benefit from inclusion rather than integration.
Let's go to Julie before we start looking at some of the recommendations. So just hold your thoughts here. Julie, Roy would have ventured into the 90s. But let's go back to the 80s when you wrote CXC. What were some of the challenges you experienced? You said that, when you went into the classroom for the first time, you went back and said, it was pretty easy. But what were some of the challenges that you experienced, if any, preparing for CXC and even at that higher level in secondary school at St. Rose's?
Like I said, they had started to prepare us even at the David Rose School because, like in every other experiment, I suppose, you would have a pilot, and they did have a pilot for this hybrid kind of learning that we were exposed to. In 1979, two students, they were visually impaired. They went off to North Georgetown to see how it would work. In the meantime, totally blind students like myself, well, basically me, was exposed to typing. And the argument was blind people can type because a typist does not look at the paper on which she's typing. So I learned to type and I mastered the keys took a lot of time at home and so on, a lot of practice, but I had learned the keys. The challenge I had in the classroom, not at the exams, but in the classroom, was trying to keep up with the teachers and the note taking. I had learned Braille and I know Braille very well, but the Brailler, I didn't have one, and even if I did, it would have been very noisy and distracting. So I used the Braille slate. It is painstaking because you have to press out every dot of every letter of every word, and it slows you up tremendously. So many of times in my attempt to keep up with the teachers in the classroom, I would leave out large chunks of what she or he had said. And sometimes also in trying to be as quick on the braille slate as I can, or as I could, I made mistakes in some of the letters. So sometimes when I went back to read, I would tell people, I can't even understand my own handwriting, you know. So though that was a big challenge for me, keeping up with the teachers, because the classroom wasn't adjusted to me. I had to adjust to the classroom. I couldn't take the typewriter in because it was noisy. I couldn't take the brailler in because that was noisy too. So I had to rely on the braille slate, and that, for me, was a huge challenge.
Were recorders available to you at that time?
No, except in the unit. But it's only after I did A-levels that I started using a tape recorder in the classroom. But for CXC, no, I did not use a tape recorder.
So it was just a braille slate and
so
memory.
it was a slavish thing.
And how many subjects did you write?
I wrote 5 subjects because I guess I could have written more, but because of the limitation in teaching, maths was definitely off limits. I did maths at the Hadley School for the Blind, but in terms of doing it for CXC, that was out. We were exposed to biology and history, English literature and English language itself, food and nutrition, and
so subjects that
something that didn't require too much of drawing and underlining and grafts and stuff
and practical
like that.
And so on. But
well, the food and nutrition had some amount of practical, but that was easily handled because we were exposed to home economics at the David Rose School for Handicapped, or now Special Needs Children.
Education School. All right, Judy. Roy, as an educator, we're not going to focus on your time in the system as a student, but as an educator, what are some of the challenges as an educator working in your time as working with children with vision disabilities? What were some of the challenges before we get into recommendations?
Yes, well, Julie pointed out the thing about lack of equipment. That is one very big challenge, and that limits the attainment of the blind students. Now, I'll give you an example. Maths. Now, when you get into maths, and this is what I tell people, you see, chemistry, physics, maths, those are the easiest subjects on the planet. I don't know why they say is bright people just do them things. To me, history and English and those things are much harder. And when you are able to learn, well, let's confine ourselves to mathematics. Julie spoke about the difficulty in drawing graphs and that kind of thing. With some equipment and some creativity, all of that can be overcome. That need not be a challenge at all. You have equipment. A lot of devices now are being invented that can help the blind child to draw graphs, to follow the information that would be depicted on a graph, and so on. So one of the main challenges we have in Guyana here is lack of equipment. And I think that the Ministry of Education is doing a good job, because what happens is that as you make your request to them, they respond immediately. That has been my experience with the system. All right? If we can develop ourselves in the field of maths and science, then we would have blind children developing themselves in that area too, because what we have now, sadly, is that their attainment is being limited, not because they are limited in ability, but because the facilities that they have are limited.
That's true, because like I said, I did maths at the Hadley School for the Blind, and it was not that difficult, but doing it in Guyana here as part of the education system was difficult. But Roy, I would just like to stick in a little pin.
Go ahead.
Everything is evolving. So I guess in the 70s, certainly in the 80s, computers weren't like they are now. The technology just wasn't there. Some of it was, but not to the extent that it is now. So I guess from that standpoint, it was always going to be a challenge to engage blind students in learning maths beyond what they could have learned with Braille.
Yeah, I appreciate that
Now,
too.
of course, it's a whole different ball game, and so
But Braille has also evolved.
Yes.
Braille has definitely evolved
Well,
too.
let me just address what you're saying there too, Julie, all right? Because I teach math as a blind teacher.
And you teach that to sighted children.
Right. And I think that if you had blind teachers of mathematics, then the blind students would have been able to attain
Maybe that was
more.
the whole thing.
Because, for example, let's talk about drawing graphs on the Cartesian plane, your x and your y axes and so on, and then you have the various grids where the two points would intersect.
Yes.
All right. Let me tell you, that can be done so simply, and it doesn't take equipment to do it. I can do that on a blackboard. Let me give you my concept. You have a string, and you have beads at regular intervals on that string. As a matter of fact, several strings just stretch across the blackboard, and the beads fall exactly under each other, coming down. All right? Though each bead can represent where the x and the y axis intersect. All right? And it is very, very easy to do.
Innovation and
Right.
Yes, that's what.
but it's almost program time. But what I want to get, do we have trained personnel
that is my
to
big
work with this group?
Okay,
You know,
now,
Roy, you've been in the system. You're no
all
longer
right,
in the system.
that is what we're talking about, the difference between integration and inclusion. Now, what inclusion says is that the system has to adapt itself to suit the needs of the visually impaired child. So if you have children that are attending the mainstream school system, the teachers there should be equipped to help them. It should
But
not
are
be
they?
an instant. Well, no. And the thing is, the system too is putting pressure on our teachers, because most classrooms are overcrowded.
Yep.
And so for the mainstream teacher to
work with that
to
child
work
who's
with
blind.
that child is kind of challenging for them.
But-
So they are making their best effort, I know, all right, but it would take them some time. And maybe what could happen is, like at the university, or maybe at
Teacher training
the
college.
teacher training college,
training college,
as they
sure.
teach the teachers to convey the content to their students, they should also teach them to do the same to blind students. And so that when the child goes to the classroom, they should not have to depend on a backup system from the unit for the
It
blind.
should be
And-
part of the general
right.
system.
And I think that is going to ensure that they will be able to benefit from all aspects. So if your math teacher in school can be innovative to teach the child, for example, how to draw a matrix or the whatever, then that child will be able to gain
But
and
just let me
perform in
Yeah,
that
what-
area.
before-
it's program
let's come into
almost.
program time. But what the blind child, particularly the one that is born blind, they will have to be prepared. They will have to be exposed to things like the computer and so on because they can't go into the classroom.
But that is where
to write.
specialized training
So
comes in
that
from.
you will definitely still need specialized training. Is what I'm trying to say.
But that is where the unit for the blind or the
Exactly.
society for the blind and so on comes in. But you know, it's program time. I'm sure we can go on and on, Roy and Julie. But I want to thank you very much for sharing. And a lot came out, and I'm sure a lot more will come out in the not too distant future. And you know, we will have a more public discussion on where blind education is and where, as blind persons, we would like for it to be in order to benefit students who are blind and visually impaired that are currently in the education system and those that will come in the future. So, Roy, you know, thank you for the work that you are doing and what I've done in the field of education, not just for persons who are blind, but generally, and you know, setting a bar as a blind educator. And Julie, thank you also for the work that you have done as an advocate and is continue to do as an advocate for persons who are blind and visually impaired and persons with disabilities in general. So thank you very much again. I know the time was not enough. I do apologize for that. But, you know, to the public out there, I'm sure that our discussion was beneficial to you, especially if you're associated with someone who's blind or even if you're blind. And we'll share a lot more in the not too distant future on this topic. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
having me on the program, guys.
Thanks for having me.